Hello, I'm Rebecca Dorch, the Senior Spectrum Policy Analyst at the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, which is the research lab of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. With me today is Mark Gibson. Mark is Senior Director of Business Development and Spectrum Policy at CommScope. Mark has a wealth of knowledge and experience with many different spectrum sharing scenarios over his career. Mark has also served on the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, which advises NTIA leadership on spectrum matters. Today, Mark has kindly agreed to share his expertise with us and discuss lessons learned from one of the spectrum sharing scenarios that is often used as an example of a spectrum sharing failure, TV white spaces. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Rebecca. It's fun here to talk about failure.
Yes, nice way to start it.
Yep.
So let's start with a little bit of background here. So the Federal Communications Commission actually has a couple of paragraphs on its website about TV white spaces. If anybody's interested in it, they can look it up by just plugging in FCC and TV white spaces. Even TVWS works. There, the FCC explains what white spaces is, and it's basically spectrum within the television band that is unused in low population or low density areas of the country, because not all of the available over-the-air television stations are actually in use in those areas where there's low population. So the initial idea behind the TV white spaces was that this very valuable spectrum, but that was unused, could be exploited for other purposes, for innovation, for experimental use, for expanded broadband capacity and access. So this effort then began in 2004, the initial set of rules being adopted in 2008. Now, preparing for this interview, I actually looked up the status of the proceeding and discovered that the FCC is continuing to work on the white spaces proceeding, even here in 2022. And in fact, in a January order, they indicated that they would be taking steps to sustain and spur growth of the white spaces ecosystem and provide certainty. Now, when I read that, I was struck by the word certainty because it was one of the descriptors you used when we were talking about the TV white spaces earlier. So before we get into the lessons learned, could you take a few minutes here and walk us through a little bit of the history of the TV white spaces and some of the other spectrum sharing efforts that actually impacted the success of TV white spaces?
Sure. And that's a great startup. So, it's interesting. TV white spaces, the first, I guess, idea behind sort of centralized dynamic spectrum sharing occurred in PCS in like 1995. It was called the Frequency Agile Sharing Technology, and it was proposed by a company called American Personal Communications, or APC, in the DC market. And the idea was exactly like what we have in TV white spaces and in others. I'm sure folks have heard about TV SAS and even the AFC, where you have a centralized database that can provide information to base stations to help them avoid interfering. In this case, it was with microwave. So that was in 95. So over the years, the FCC thought, and this was because others had suggested, that the TV bands, much of the TV spectrum lay fallow because of old TV rules based on analog television with really weird frequency separations. And so with the advent of digital television, it removed a lot of those antiquated protection requirements and left spectrum available. So they got the idea, and I don't think they got it on their own. I think there were some requests for rulemaking that started it along the path of having the band not even reallocated, because there's a lot of unlicensed use under Part 15 that occurs across the TV spectrum, primarily for things like wireless microphones, wireless TV pickup, and things like that. But they thought having a more focused rulemaking on a sharing methodology, which then was the TV whitespace database. Oh, actually, not. They didn't start with the TV whitespace database. They started with sensing. That the devices would sense their environment, similar to the way it happens in Wi-Fi. Contention-based protocols, sensing and collision avoidance and things like that. But the universe was larger than they expected in terms of the area of operation, and they did a lot of tests in the DC area and realized that sensing by itself wouldn't work. So they came along and added the database concept, sort of as a belt and suspenders. And actually, over time, the database concept took over, and the sensing hasn't even happened yet. So I think you mentioned that the rulemaking was started in 2004. and it established the whole concept of white space, which, as you said, was the ability to allow unlicensed operation in the areas where TV are not operating in a manner that would not interfere with TV receivers, which is, you know, everybody's TV sets. And all of that operation is managed by a database, and theoretically everything works fine. So, but we'll get to some of the things that you say may call it as a failure.
Well, let me ask you, and this may be jumping ahead to one of the failures, but you had also talked about the frequency that was is used for the TV white spaces for the and how the DTV transition impacted that. Was that part of this the setup, or is that part of the lessons learned here?
That actually, it's a bit in the middle. The DTV transition was envisioned across all of the TV bands. So that was channel 14 to channel the upper one. I forget what the upper channel is. I've got it here. The upper channel. I can't remember what it was, but the upper TV channel, which was channel 51, which is 698 megahertz, the upper end. So the entire DTV transition was to take advantage of, you know, digital television, and that was a big deal. That was managed by NTIA, by the way, the B-top or the set-top box thing, which is a whole other thing.
Program.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the idea was that the protection requirements that existed for all the old analog were no longer needed. And so that made a whole bunch of spectrum available that otherwise would have lain fallow or lay fallow. And so the idea was to make it available for this TV white space. And it's interesting because initially, right now it's got a niche play, but initially the whole idea was it was called Super Wi-Fi. And so the idea was to, you know, supercharge Wi-Fi on 6 megahertz channels. It was going to be awesome. And then what happened, you will get into this, is one of maybe the roads to failure was then they reallocated upper portions of the band for the 600 megahertz, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it was really to take advantage of the DTV transition.
Okay, great. So when we chatted earlier, you did actually identify three key areas that you thought would provide lessons learned from the TV white spaces effort. One of them was regulations and having to do with certainty or uncertainty and changes in the regulations, specifically also with respect to the database testing and certification. Another one was the market for the TV white spaces devices, with it being maybe an undefined market for purposes of the types of equipment that would be and the services that would be offered within the TV white spaces spectrum. And then the databases, which you've already touched on just a little bit, as one of the first externally managed databases, I believe. And there was a lack of clarity on some of the responsibilities of the administrators that beyond what was in the regulations from the FCC. So you want to walk us through each one of these?
Sure. So I think, you know, and you know, we'll have a panel this week or maybe next week to talk about other lessons learned, and I've got a ton of lessons learned. But I call this regulatory uncertainty, and in fact, I say the band was sort of plagued with regulatory uncertainty. And, you know, I don't know that this is the fault of anybody. You know, the FCC was, for all intents and purposes, making some of this up as they went along, based on input from the community. For example, the initial effort to use sensing only and then go to database was informed by the community. And actually, the FCC conducted a lot of those tests. In fact, I remember seeing Julie Knapp at his own garage doing testing. So that was kind of cool. But what happened was the rules came out, and then there was changes to the rules, and then subsequent changes to the rules, and each of those rules changes caused the ecosystem, which included the database administrators, the device manufacturers, and the potential users, to have to react. And so, and the other thing I'll say, and you know, this is kind of where we get to the failure part of it. Probably the biggest issue that we faced ultimately was the reallocation of the spectrum above channel 37, starting at 614 megahertz to 657 megahertz or 658 megahertz to the 600 megahertz band, and then set up the incentive auction. And that did a couple of things. One is it removed about 210 megahertz of spectrum that could have been used for TV white space, but also most people will remember that the incentive auction, part of the incentives were for TV stations that were in that UHF spectrum to either go off the air for some compensation or to be relocated for a cost recovery relocation. And they all relocated down into the spectrum below channel 37, which was 52 megahertz all the way up to 608 megahertz, with chunks out of the middle. And so that effectively removed, like I said, 210 megahertz of spectrum for white space use, and then all the TV stations that were up there, which there are more TV stations in UHF than there are in VHF, just because UHF is a lot cleaner. The VHF spectrum has just got a lot of noise in it. So that basically, when that happened, the database administrators, ourselves included, just said, you know what, there's not a thing here, and we're going to go off and do other things. So that was probably the main issue we had with respect to regulatory uncertainty. And then because of this uncertainty, both in regulations and in spectrum availability, the device ecosystem was very slow to develop. There were several that put a lot of effort into it. Some actually that were startups because of TV white space, but they never really got their niche, if you will, or their groove. And today, a lot of that has been overtaken by some work that Microsoft is doing in their Airband initiative. Some of them still exist. Companies like Adaptrum and Carlson. And Carlson Wireless had a lot of use across other unlicensed spectrum, as well as in the 3650 to 3700 meg band. But for there to be a robust operator ecosystem or user ecosystem, there's got to be a device ecosystem, and that never really came together. And then finally,
can I ask, Mark, if I'm sorry, is the reason potentially why the device market didn't come together was because the market for the devices was not large enough to scale properly?
Well, not only was it not large enough to scale, it was not large enough, period. There were never more than 1,000 or so registrations in any TV white space database. And today there's only 300. And there's a single database administrator. One of the things I didn't mention was when the FCC, and actually they've done this pretty consistently with the subsequent efforts, but when the FCC issued the public notice for database administrators to submit proposals, they got 9 initially, and then they got another one, so a total of 10. So 10 people signed up to be database administrators, so there was no dearth of database administrators. But now you've got all these database administrators, ideally, competing for a very small market. And in the end, you couldn't support 9. And in fact, the one that's doing it now is not even one of the originals. It's Red Technologies, actually out of France, who actually are doing the same thing in France and in Canada. So yeah, the device ecosystem really never developed because the user ecosystem never developed, and so it's really right now very much a niche play. And that's the rural aspect that the commission talks about now that you read about. It's mostly rural and unserved markets.
Okay, so if I can summarize, one of the problems potentially was that the upfront research was incomplete.
Mm-hmm.
And then the available spectrum changed on the mid process,
mm-hmm.
which is never a good idea to change where you're going to be operating.
Yep.
And then both the markets for the devices and the markets for the users actually never really developed appropriately.
That's right. And the other thing you asked about was collaboration among database administrators. And this is another thing that sort of happened as we went along. What the FCC wanted to ensure was that, which is interesting, when the commission went from the traditional analog TV to digital, the databases that the commission has for TV stations no longer contain the TV contours. And for those that don't know, TV contours are the areas within which TV stations are protected with reception of normal TV stations in those contour areas. Those are called protected contours. Well, the calculation of those contours changed with digital television for lots of reasons, most of which is that DTV has a much better threshold. So they were actually theoretically larger, but the commission didn't calculate them anymore. They made the database administrators calculate them, and they made us all calculate them the same way. So we all had to work together to calculate the TV contours the same way, which one might argue we should have to, so we all have the same baseline data. But then they made us work together to calculate spectrum availability the same way. So in the end, there was really no way for database administrators to differentiate themselves in terms of ability to provide spectrum availability. And maybe the commission didn't want that. I think that's one of the lessons learned that went into went into CBRS and 6 gigahertz. But the amount of effort it took for the database administrators to coordinate that work was long and arduous. We were part of meetings that occurred monthly for about a year. So that was a lot of work, and we weren't generating any revenue during those times, which we understand is a cost of doing business, but we didn't know about that going in.
That's great. And I do think that it was a lesson learned that was taken well by the commission and learned from for purposes of CBRS, because the SAS administrators are actually able to differentiate themselves. Even though they all have to use a lot of the same types of algorithms and ways of measuring and analyzing, but they can differentiate themselves in other ways. So, all right, so let's kind of go towards that, which is what other lessons learned have actually has the industry, regulators, government, or whatever folks, service providers taken from the TV white spaces lessons learned and applied them into more recent proceedings?
Well, there's a lot. Thankfully, we all learned. But I'd say, one thing I didn't mention was when the commission wanted these databases certified. So when it tested and certified. And for TV whitespace, the FCC did the testing themselves, and of course they would do the certification anyhow. And that was another problem that happened, just because there was one guy doing it, and they needed to do it, I think, initially, so they understood what was involved with database testing. So that one lesson learned, and you and I have talked extensively about this, when they got to CBRS, they didn't do it themselves. They actually used a third party, which was ITS, and you led that whole process, which we all had the scars from that, but we got through it. But I'd say that compared to what they did for TV whitespace, that process, at least theoretically, was well designed, and it was designed to ensure that the databases adhered to the requirements and the rules. And that's a whole other thing. But we had a set of requirements that was developed by the Wireless Innovation Forum, and those were based on the rules. So we tried to ensure through that whole process that all the SASs corresponded to a very specific set of requirements. And while it was arduous coming up with that, I think in the end, and I'll speak for ourselves, I think we're better for it. And I also think that lesson learned going into the next instantiation of this, which is AFC for 6 gigahertz, is something that we're now going back and saying, okay, we have the way the commission did it, we had the way we did it for SAS. Now maybe there's another way to do it. So we'll see what happens. We're still waiting for them to decide how they're going to test, and we'll test the AFCs. But that whole process is built on sort of this framework that we established with CBRS and with TV whitespace.
Yeah, and in fact, I think one of the lessons learned, obviously then from the TV whitespaces database, which is why they actually asked another federal agency to do the sort of the initial database testing for the SASs, is because they really hadn't done, the FCC hadn't really done that software-based testing in the past. And ITS is normally not in the business of doing the sorts of work that the private sector can do. But because this hadn't been done before, and it was the first time that the FCC had to look at a complex database that had software on it, that they then used us as a basic proof of concept in that sense. And so now that we've established that we can do it, and it's successful, I would expect that the next round of any certification of databases and software would in fact be handled in the normal sort of process that other types of certified devices and are handled by the FCC.
I hope that there, and you and I have talked about this, that you worked on sort of an after action lessons learned yourself from that whole process. And so I hope that if you haven't presented that to the commission, that you can before we get into AFC, so that, because there's a lot of things that are unique to this whole thing that were fleshed out in that testing, that I think it would be helpful for the commission to have and make available also, because it's looking like they're going to go with third-party testing. third-party test labs. So the question right now is whether they use existing third-party labs, which are people that do device testing, or people that just want to do testing of the databases themselves. And I think from what you guys did, probably one of the best things that comes out of that, in addition to having SASA certified, is those after-action guidances that the commission can use. So if you have something like that, make it available. I think I'd love to see it.
Well, before we move on to lessons learned from CBRS, which we will be covering in the conference itself, is there anything else on the TV white spaces that you think that you wanted to mention, where we have learned and the commission has learned, and the whole, the industry has learned, and we've improved our processes and efforts based upon how difficult TV white spaces was for a lot of folks?
Well, TV white space is the first thing, so it's like it was a first generation, so all first G stuff is always kind of a little bit kludgy. What you end up with is not what you thought of what it would look like as you go into it. I think for CBRS, notwithstanding the length of time it took, which is really a combination of things, I think coming out of that, it's pretty much what we expected it would look like going into it. But there's two things I think, or at least one thing, maybe two, that I think we need to keep in mind, and that is we can't change the rules of the game in the middle when we're expecting commercial entities to be database providers. For example, like I said, the whole reallocation of spectrum, thereby removing the market, and this is happening now to CBRS. And again, this is a lesson we'll learn. We'll talk about next week or this week, whenever this runs. But on the either side of the CBRS band are high-powered bands, which nobody knew about when we started this whole SAS thing. Now the good news is there are 238 licensees that won spectrum in the auction. That's more than any other auction, and more licenses than any other auction. So there's obviously a need for this type of spectrum licensing for the masses. And if you look at it and you take out the ones that spent the most money and got the most market, it's a real interesting potpourri of different use cases and different people. And that was what this was intended to be. But the costs of providing SaaS service on top of that are difficult, which is one of the reasons that we're no longer a SaaS provider. But the fact that on either side of the band, before we actually went into this, was allocated to high-powered operation meant that a lot of people then gravitated toward the high-powered operation and maybe leaving CBRS, which might not have been the initial intent. And if we, and I'll speak for our company, had known that there was a likelihood of there being high-powered operation on both sides of the band, we might have taken a different approach to the business case. So one of the things I suggest in my set of lessons learned is we need to have longer-term planning for spectrum allocation considerations. Longer being not 3 to 5, but 5 to 7 years. And I know that's hard. And I know a lot of this stuff is driven by requests for rulemaking and things like that. But the upshot of that is that we have people that, and maybe it's incumbent upon the industry to have some degree of perspicaciousness to be able to identify what's going on. But I think we're all in this together. So I think changing the rules in the middle of it is one of the things that we need to work on.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things that we're going to be looking at and tackling during ISART 2022 is how do we evolve the spectrum sharing rules based upon data science and scientific sort of decision making. Yeah. So we're actually posing, how do we learn from ground truth and evolve and improve the rules, maybe adding some uncertainty, which based upon this conversation may not be the best thing to do, is to add uncertainty. So, well, you're on one of the panels on the first day on the industry lessons learned. And so I am really looking forward to what you have to share on that panel also, because we've got folks from have different experiences in different parts of the industry for spectrum sharing purposes on that panel. So, Mark, I want to thank you very much for talking with me today and doing this interview and helping us understand the history of TV white spaces and how it has kind of had a thread throughout a lot of the subsequent spectrum sharing proceedings that we have all been involved in over the years. So
my pleasure, Rebecca. Thank you so much for your interest, and I'm looking forward to the sessions as well.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you.